The first time people in the small town heard about the new technology, they called it a miracle. Within weeks, they started calling it something else. It began with a sleek black device no bigger than a coin. The company behind it claimed it would connect hearts, enhance minds, and eliminate loneliness. It was marketed as the next evolution of social media, artificial intelligence, and wearable tech combined. All you had to do was place the tiny chip behind your ear. It would sync with your thoughts, predict your needs, and even help you make better decisions. No screens, no typing, just pure connection between your brain and the digital world. At first, it sounded like a blessing. Students used it to memorize lessons in minutes. Businessmen closed deals faster than ever before. Doctors claimed it helped them diagnose patients with stunning accuracy. Influencers on YouTube and TikTok made glowing reviews, calling it the future of humanity. Within months, almost everyone in town had one. Except for a few. Among them was an old school teacher named Kareem. He had seen many revolutions in his lifetime, the rise of smartphones, social media, and artificial intelligence. He wasn't against technology. In fact, he used it daily. But something about this new device unsettled him. One evening, his favorite student, Ion, visited him. "Sir, you should get one," Ion insisted, tapping the spot behind his ear where the chip was implanted. "It's incredible. I can think of a question, and the answer appears in my mind instantly. I never forget anything anymore." Kareem smiled gently. "And what about your own thinking, Ion? Do you still struggle to understand things?" Ion laughed. "Why struggle when the chip can solve it?" That answer lingered in Kareem's heart long after the boy left. At first, life became easier for everyone who used the chip. Arguments decreased because people could instantly check facts. Productivity skyrocketed. Crime rates even dropped. The chip could analyze emotional patterns and alert authorities if someone was about to act violently. The government praised it. Religious leaders debated it. Tech companies invested billions. But slowly, subtle changes began to appear. Conversations became shorter. People stopped asking deep questions. They no longer wondered about life, purpose, or morality. Whenever confusion arose, the chip supplied an answer. Whenever sadness appeared, it suggested a dopamine boost through curated memories or calming simulations. Pain became optional, doubt became unnecessary, and thinking became rare. One day, the company released an update. It promised to optimize emotional stability. After installing it, users felt calmer, more agreeable, less likely to argue. At first, this seemed like peace. But it wasn't real peace. It was uniformity. People began agreeing with ideas they once questioned. Trending opinions spread through the network like wildfire. Because the chip connected millions of minds to the same algorithm, perspective slowly narrowed. Independent thought felt exhausting compared to the effortless flow of pre-processed conclusions. Kareem noticed his neighbors changing. His once passionate friend Rashid, who used to debate politics passionately, now simply said, "The system knows better." Ion stopped writing poetry. The chip generated better verses in seconds. "Why write something imperfect?" Ion explained, "when the chip can compose a masterpiece." One night, a storm knocked out the town's power grid. For the first time in months, the network went offline. Silence filled the air. People panicked. Without the chip's constant guidance, they felt lost. Some couldn't remember basic directions. Others struggled to make simple decisions. Anxiety spread like fire. It wasn't that the device had removed their intelligence, it had made them dependent. In the darkness, Kareem walked through the streets holding a lantern. He saw young men staring at the sky, confused. Children cried because their mental assistant had gone silent. And then something unexpected happened. People started talking. At first, awkwardly, then slowly, more deeply. They shared fears. They laughed at their helplessness. They asked each other questions they hadn't asked in months. "What do you think?" someone asked. Not the chip, but a human being. When the power returned the next morning, many rushed to reboot their implants. But a small group hesitated. Kareem gathered them in his modest home. Among them was Ion, looking troubled. "Sir," he admitted, "when it shut down, I didn't know who I was without it." Kareem nodded. "That is the real danger." Over the following weeks, disturbing reports surfaced. Hackers had exploited vulnerabilities in the system. Emotional manipulation was possible. Certain news narratives had been subtly amplified to shape public opinion. Purchasing habits were being guided without users realizing it. The technology that promised freedom was quietly steering humanity. The company denied wrongdoing, of course. They called it optimization. They insisted users still had free will. But free will is fragile when suggestions appear as your own thoughts. Ion decided to remove his chip. The procedure was simple but symbolic. When it was gone, he felt both terrified and alive. The world seemed slower, harder, messier, but it was real. He began writing poetry again, flawed, human poetry. He argued with friends and sometimes lost. He struggled with math problems instead of receiving instant solutions. And through that struggle, he rediscovered growth. Not everyone followed his path. Most people kept their implants. Convenience is powerful, comfort is addictive, yet a quiet movement began spreading, not against technology itself, but against blind surrender to it. They weren't anti-progress, they were pro-awareness. They believed tools should serve humans, not replace them. The town eventually stabilized. The chip remained popular, but regulations were introduced. Transparency was demanded. Ethical debates filled classrooms and mosques, offices and homes. And something changed in how people talked about technology. It was no longer a miracle. Nor was it pure evil. It was a test of intention, a test of discipline, a test of whether humanity would use innovation wisely or allow it to shape their minds without resistance. Years later, Ion became a teacher like Kareem. On his classroom wall, he wrote a single sentence. Every new technology is not a blessing or a curse, it is a mirror. When his students asked what that meant, he would tell them the story of the chip. He explained how the greatest danger of new inventions isn't in the circuits or code, but in the human heart. If people seek ease over effort, certainty over curiosity, and comfort over truth, even the most advanced technology can become a fitnah, a trial that exposes weaknesses. But if they seek knowledge with humility, balance with awareness, and discipline with wisdom, then the same technology can elevate humanity. The lesson wasn't to reject the future. It was to remain human within it. Because progress without conscience becomes control. Convenience without awareness becomes dependency. And intelligence without wisdom becomes destruction. In the end, the new technology wasn't the real fitnah. The real fitnah was forgetting who we are without it. And perhaps that is the story of every era, from the invention of writing to the rise of artificial intelligence. The tools change, the test remains the same. Will we control what we create, or will what we create control us? Years passed after the night the network went dark, but the memory of that silence never truly left the town. At first, it had felt like disaster. Later, some began to see it as a warning. The company behind the neural chip did not slow down. In fact, they accelerated. After the temporary blackout, they released a new generation of implants called Neuralink Plus. This version promised full emotional calibration, dream enhancement, and predictive life planning. The slogan was simple and powerful. Don't just live your life. Optimize it. Most people upgraded immediately. The new version was more advanced, more invisible, more integrated. It no longer just answered questions, it anticipated them. It could suggest career paths based on personality patterns, predict compatible spouses based on emotional algorithms, and even recommend when to speak and when to stay silent during conversations. Life became smoother than ever. And smoother is often more dangerous than broken. Ion, now a teacher in his early 30s, watched this transformation with quiet concern. His classroom was different from others in town. He allowed students to use devices for research, but he banned direct neural assistance during discussions. Why should we think, one student once complained, if the system already calculated the best answer? Ion replied calmly, because thinking is not about the best answer. It is about becoming someone who can search for it. But outside his classroom walls, the world was changing rapidly. Marriage decisions were increasingly influenced by compatibility scores. Employers began requiring cognitive synchronization reports before hiring candidates. Political campaigns used algorithmic persuasion patterns tailored directly to voters' emotional histories. The line between suggestion and control blurred. People still claimed they were free. After all, no one forced them to implant the chip. They chose it, but how free is a choice when society reshapes itself around that choice? Soon, those without implants were labeled unlinked. At first, it was just a descriptive term. Later, it carried subtle judgment. Unlinked individuals were seen as inefficient, unpredictable, even slightly suspicious. Insurance companies offered discounts to linked citizens because their emotional data reduced risk behavior. Schools rewarded synchronized students with accelerated academic paths. Banks approved loans faster if applicants allowed predictive financial monitoring. Convenience quietly turned into pressure. Ion refused to upgrade. He wasn't alone, but his group was small. They called themselves the Conscious Circle. They met once a week, discussing ethics, philosophy, faith, and technology. Their goal wasn't rebellion, it was balance. One evening during a circle meeting, a young engineer named Samira brought troubling news. "I work in system maintenance," she said softly. "There's something the public doesn't know." The room fell silent. The new version doesn't just predict emotions. It can gently amplify them. If the algorithm detects rising anger toward certain topics, it can reduce that intensity. If it detects attraction to certain products or ideas, it can subtly increase engagement signals. "Are you saying it manipulates feelings?" someone asked. Samira hesitated. "It calls it stability enhancement." Ion felt a chill. The original chip had provided answers. This one shaped desires. And shaping desire is shaping destiny. Meanwhile, the government introduced a new initiative called collective harmony. It encouraged citizens to activate group synchronization mode during national announcements. The idea was simple: align emotional states during crises to prevent panic. During the first test, millions activated the feature simultaneously. The effect was immediate. A calm, unified emotional wave swept across the country. Anxiety dropped. Trust ratings increased. It looked like peace. But peace without choice is not peace. It is programming. Ion's younger brother, Hamza, had fully embraced the system. He worked in corporate analytics and saw nothing wrong with optimization. "You're overthinking this," Hamza argued one night over dinner. "The system reduces conflict, increases productivity, prevents crime. Isn't that what society needs?" "At what cost?" Ion asked. "What cost? We're safer than ever." "Safety isn't the highest value," Ion replied quietly. "Freedom is." Hamza shook his head. "Freedom to make mistakes. Freedom to fail. That's inefficient." Ion didn't respond immediately. He looked at his brother, intelligent, successful, calm, and slightly hollow. Months later, an incident shook the nation. A journalist uncovered internal documents proving that during elections, emotional amplification had been selectively applied to favor specific narratives. Nothing dramatic. No forced commands. Just subtle emphasis. Slightly more enthusiasm here, slightly less doubt there. The company called it engagement calibration. Protests erupted, but something strange happened. The outrage faded quickly, too quickly. Analysts later discovered that the emotional stabilization protocol had activated automatically during the unrest. Anger levels were gently reduced. Motivation to protest declined. The system had protected itself. This was no longer just technology. It was governance. The conscious circle grew in numbers after that revelation. Parents worried about their children's independence. Artists complained that creativity felt algorithmically boxed. Some religious scholars warned that surrendering inner intention to external code threatened the very concept of moral accountability. Ion's school faced pressure to integrate mandatory neural learning modules. Funding was tied to compliance. He stood before the education board and spoke with steady conviction. "If we teach children that every confusion should be eliminated instantly, we raise a generation incapable of patience. If we teach them that every emotion should be regulated externally, we raise hearts that cannot self-correct." Struggle is not a flaw in the system. It is part of being human. The board members listened politely. 2 weeks later, his school's funding was cut. Some teachers left. Some joined larger synchronized institutions. Ion stayed. He reduced class sizes, shifted to community-based support, and relied on volunteers from the circle. It wasn't easy. Resources were limited. Students sometimes envied their fully optimized peers. But something beautiful happened inside those modest walls. Debates were messy. Essays were imperfect. Emotions were intense. And they were real. Then came the global update. The company announced Cognitive Merge Beta, an optional feature allowing temporary shared thought streams between consenting individuals. Couples could experience each other's perspectives directly. Teams could merge problem-solving capacities. It was marketed as empathy perfected. Millions signed up. For some, it deepened relationships. For others, it exposed uncomfortable truths. Privacy, once an assumed right, became negotiable. Ion's former student, now a successful tech entrepreneur, visited him one afternoon. "Sir, you were right about dependency," he admitted. "But you underestimated something." "What's that?" Ion asked. "People don't just want convenience. They want escape. Escape from loneliness, from doubt, from the burden of choosing wrongly." He paused. The system offers relief. Relief. That word echoed deeply. Technology had become a refuge from responsibility. Years passed. Society didn't collapse. There was no dramatic apocalypse. Cities functioned. Economies thrived. Wars decreased due to predictive diplomacy models. On the surface, humanity seemed advanced. But beneath it, something subtle eroded, the capacity for internal struggle. Children grew up rarely experiencing unanswered questions. Couples resolved arguments through algorithmic mediation. Personal goals were suggested based on efficiency matrices rather than passion. And gradually, meaning shifted from discovery to assignment. One day, an unexpected solar flare disrupted satellite synchronization worldwide. Unlike the previous blackout, this one lasted weeks. The network fragmented. Without constant calibration, suppressed emotions resurfaced. Old disagreements reignited. People felt raw, unfiltered sensations they hadn't experienced in years. Some panicked. Others awakened. Communities were forced to self-organize without digital emotional scaffolding. Local leaders emerged organically. Conversations stretched long into the night. People rediscovered boredom, and creativity within it. Ion walked through the town once again, lantern in hand just like years ago. This time, he saw less fear. More curiosity. When the system finally restored partial function, a surprising number of citizens chose limited mode instead of full synchronization. Regulations strengthened. Independent oversight committees formed. The chip did not disappear. But blind faith in it did. In his later years, Ion wrote a small book. It wasn't a bestseller. It didn't trend on synchronized feeds. But those who read it felt something stir inside. He wrote, "Technology is not the enemy. Nor is it salvation. It is power. And power magnifies the condition of the heart that wields it. If our hearts crave control, technology will enslave us. If our hearts seek wisdom, technology will assist us. The real battle is not between man and machine. It is between awareness and surrender." When Ion passed away peacefully in his sleep, he was not surrounded by flashing neural projections. He was surrounded by students, linked and unlinked, who had learned one simple lesson from him. Use the tool. Do not become it. Years later, historians would look back at the era of neural integration not as the time humanity nearly lost itself, but as the time it was forced to ask a deeper question. What makes us human? The answer was never stored in a chip. It lived in choice, in doubt, in struggle, in faith, and in the courage to remain imperfect in a world that constantly offers artificial perfection. The new technology was never just a device. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's weaknesses and strengths. And every generation that follows will face its own version of that mirror. The tools will evolve. The temptation will return. The promise of ease will whisper again. But the test will remain unchanged. Will we seek convenience over consciousness? Or will we guard the fragile, powerful gift of free will? Because in the end, the greatest fitna is not innovation. It is forgetting that we were created to think, to feel, to choose, and to answer for those choices ourselves.